On December 21st, 1978, John Wayne Gacy was arrested in connection to the disappearance of a local boy, Robert Peace. The following day, police would discover a literal graveyard beneath the house while serving a search warrant. The graves were so numerous, it took over a month just to recover all the bodies from the property. In total, the bodies of 29 boys and young men were found, with 4 additional ones found in a nearby river. It would take several months to identify most of the victims, with 5 of them remaining unknown to this day. Welcome back, everyone. My name is Blue, and as you may already know from my last video, I'm a police officer in Miami with 10 years of experience. In this channel, we'll be going over all things crime-related. Only here you'll be able to get the unique perspective from someone with actual law enforcement experience. Today, we'll be reviewing the case of John Wayne Gacy and asking this series' ultimate question: how did he get away with it for so long? We'll start this one with a basic background of our subject, John Wayne Gacy. Gacy was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois. He was raised by his father, John Stanley Gacy, and mother, Marianne Elaine Robinson, alongside his 2 sibling sisters. Gacy claims to have had an abusive relationship with his father, who often berated or beat him for being weak or unmanly. Gacy also claims to have been a victim of sexual abuse, first by a 15-year-old neighbor girl when he was 5, and then later by a family friend when he was 8. Gacy would say the family friend would wrestle him and use that as an excuse to inappropriately touch him, which prompted Gacy to tell his father that he didn't want to be alone with the friend anymore. According to Gacy, his father made sure he never interacted with him again. While this is indeed a rough and traumatic upbringing, it alone does not account for the monster Gacy would grow to be. Christopher Barry D., criminologist and author of Born Killers, a book which focuses on the childhood of serial killers, had this to say. According to Christopher, Gacy's upbringing was far too unremarkable to explain the crimes he would go on to commit. Gacy would attend several high schools, but would drop out prior to attaining a diploma. Gacy, after numerous fights with his father, would leave his family home and go on to work at a mortuary in Las Vegas. Gacy was allowed to sleep there, and one night stated he got into a casket containing a teenage boy's body, which he would undress and fondle. Gacy stated afterwards that he was so shocked by his own actions that he called his parents and asked them to return home. They agreed, and he left the very next day, returning to Chicago. As mentioned earlier, Gacy did not receive a high school diploma. Interestingly enough, this didn't hold him back, as Gacy was able to attend and graduate from Northwestern Business College in Chicago, working as a manager at a shoe company until he would meet his first wife, Marlene Myers. Myers' father owned several KFC restaurants, and Gacy would end up managing them. Gacy and Myers would have 2 children, and Gacy would seem to be a perfectly normal model of the nuclear family, even going on to start his own contracting business. Despite being a successful businessman with a family, Gacy would find time to be active in the community, being a Democratic precinct captain. This position was seen as a volunteer community aid, and Gacy would often help people by shoveling the driveways of elderly neighbors or changing flat tires for anyone in need. During this time, Gacy was involved in local politics, organizing parties, and even becoming a member of the JCs, a charitable organization of young men looking to serve their communities. What is terrifying here is how this person, who seems like more than just a functioning member of society, but someone who goes above to serve their community, could be the same person to go on to commit such atrocities. Here we will be talking about one of the very first interactions with law enforcement, which marks one of the first and greatest chances to stop this future killer. In August of 1967, Gacy hired a 15-year-old Donald Voorhees to do odd jobs around his house. Voorhees knew Gacy through his father, who was also a JC's member. After Voorhees had finished his work, Gacy lured him to the basement with promises of alcohol and pornographic films. After getting Voorhees drunk, Gacy forced him into having oral sex. Gacy would then go on to sexually assault several other teenage boys over a 6-month period. Some would be paid off, and others threatened with blackmail. But in March of 1968, Voorhees told his father about what Gacy had done to him, which his father immediately reported to the police. Around the same time, another 16-year-old victim came forward to police about Gacy's actions. Gacy was then arrested and charged with oral sodomy of Voorhees and attempted sexual assault of the other unnamed 16-year-old. Gacy would deny the allegations, and told others that Voorhees' father was also running for a leadership position at the JCs, and was using this as a way to disqualify Gacy. Gacy would go on to pay an 18-year-old employee, Russell Schroeder, $300 to beat up and threaten Voorhees so that he wouldn't testify. Russell actually did this, but Voorhees went straight to the police after, having Russell arrested. Russell would immediately give up Gacy as the one who had paid him to do this, leading to another charge for Gacy. I would like to take a moment here and commend Voorhees for his bravery and determination in not only refusing to be intimidated, but in following through with the charges and ensuring Gacy was made to pay for his crimes. As an officer, I've seen many cases where a victim of a legitimate rape will become reluctant to press charges, even after just a few short hours. This is for many reasons, but none that were unfamiliar to Voorhees. Voorhees was making a claim against a well-known and respected member of the community, and was not believed by many around him. Also, despite the social stigma around homosexuality at the time, as well as having to tell your father such a horrific personal and traumatic thing, Voorhees stayed the course and ensured Gacy did not get away with his crimes. So despite his best efforts, Gacy pled guilty to sodomy and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. The next day, Gacy's wife would serve him with divorce papers. Gacy will go on to say this was the last time he ever saw her or his children again. On December 27, 1969, Gacy's father died of cirrhosis of the liver, which was devastating to Gacy, who would not be allowed to attend his father's funeral. Despite this, he would go on to receive his high school diploma while incarcerated and will become a head cook in prison. Despite his charges against teenage boys and his attempts to tamper with a witness by violence, Gacy was seen as a good candidate for parole. The amount of time he served, you may be wondering? 18 months. A year and a half, and he was seen fit to be released into the community. This represents a massively missed opportunity to keep the community safe. Gacy, who would be released on parole in 1971, will go on to commit all his murders until 1978. That entire span of time, he would have been locked up if justice had been served. This is something we see time and time again, and as you see, goes back decades. In the justice system, there always seems to be a breakdown in the system at some point. Here, we have a good victim, who did everything they could to ensure Gacy faced justice for his crimes, even at the threat of his own safety. We have officers who did a proper investigation and made a good arrest, built a good case for the prosecution. We then have prosecutors who convict Gacy and do not give an overly weak plea deal. We have a judge who sentences Gacy to a solid 10 years in prison. It seems that everyone came together to protect the community from this monster, and yet, even after it's all said and done, a weak-willed and naive parole board thought Gacy should be released back into the community. While it is obvious they did not know what Gacy would go on to do, it is because of their weakness on crime and willingness to let criminals free that he would ultimately go on to take the lives of at least 33 teenagers and young men in some of the most horrific ways. This first failure rests solely on their shoulders. Gacy, freshly released back into the world, will go on to move into a home in Des Plaines, Illinois, where he would live with his mother as per the terms of his parole. Gacy began to work as a cook and a contractor again. Yet in February 1971, Gacy would be arrested after luring a teenage boy to his home and attempting to rape him. Fortunately, the boy escaped and went to the police. Gacy would be charged with sexual assault once again. Here is our second incident. Let's talk about where the failings were here, as this also represents yet another chance to put Gacy back in prison for many years. In this case, the charges against Gacy would be dropped after the victim refused to show up for court. In police work, there is a saying, no victim, no crime. You cannot prosecute a crime without a victim, with very rare exception. So in short, the failure of the victim to show up here in court is devastating, and a major source of frustration for police and prosecutors. In many cases, people will report a crime to police, but fail to follow through. This is deeply disheartening, because officers will often spend hours and hours investigating, impounding evidence, completing reports, and otherwise building a solid case that will likely be scrutinized for years. And when this happens to you after many years, you quickly begin to lose passion and faith in your own work, and soon everything just becomes another burdensome load of work rather than a case you're passionate about. Secondly, there was a major failure of communication here on the side of law enforcement and the courts. Despite Gacy being arrested and on probation for the same type of crime, for unknown reasons his arrest was never reported to his parole officer. Either the cops handling the case, or more likely the state attorneys, should have contacted his parole officer. This was never done, and as such, Gacy would again be let loose on the world. But this would not be the last time Gacy would encounter law enforcement. January 2nd, 1972. This day represents a terrifying evolution in the life and crimes of Gacy. Gacy would encounter 16-year-old Timothy Jack McCoy at a bus station. McCoy was traveling home and was planning on spending the night at the bus station due to a layover. For some reason, Gacy was there, and after talking to the boy, offered to take him on a tour of the city and let him spend the night at his house so he wouldn't have to sleep outside. Timothy accepted and returned home with Gacy, who at this time lived alone. Gacy stated that the next morning, he awoke and saw Timothy standing near his bed, holding a large kitchen knife. This startled Gacy, who says in a panic he rushed Timothy, wrestled the knife from him, and stabbed him to death. Timothy would have the grim distinction of being the only one of Gacy's victims to die by stabbing. Gacy would later say that afterwards he realized he misunderstood Timothy's intentions. As we stated in our last video, we only have Gacy's version of events to go on, so please do not take every single detail he gives as absolute truth, especially when the story sounds as weak as this one. Gacy would go on to say this murder was the most sexual pleasure he had ever felt, with just the very act of murder bringing him to orgasm. Years later, after Gacy's crimes were discovered, a large bloodstain would be discovered under the rug of his parents' bedroom. Years later, after Gacy's crimes were discovered, a large bloodstain would be found under the rug of his bedroom floor, which he stated was Timothy's. Timothy would not be identified until 1986 by dental records. On July 1st, 1972, just months after murdering Timothy, Gacy would be married to his high school sweetheart, Carol Hoff. Hoff was aware of Gacy's prior imprisonment, but Gacy had convinced her it was for a less serious charge and that he was a changed man. Incredibly, just weeks after the marriage, Gacy would be arrested for sexual assault and impersonating a police officer. A teen male came forward and stated that Gacy, pretending to be a police officer, ordered him into the car and forced him to perform oral sex on Gacy. Again, ever frustratingly so, these charges would be dropped. This time, it was due to the victim trying to blackmail Gacy for money after the fact. Incredibly enough, we see our third major failure of the justice system here. Yet another arrest that goes unreported by police or the courts to Gacy's parole officer. It seems incredible that this could continue to happen, but I would like to try and offer an explanation. Gacy, while being in the same state he was released on probation in, was living in another jurisdiction than the one of his initial arrest. This could likely explain why it was not discovered that he was on probation. Interdepartmental communication was not really a thing at this time, when it came to many arrests. Today, all departments in the US are outfitted with both a state and nationwide crime information center. So when we make an arrest, we run a person's name through this database and get relevant information such as arrest history and whether or not the person is on probation or parole. This system, known as the National Crime Information Center, or NCIC, was not founded until 1967, with many smaller agencies not able to join and be connected for a decade or more. This may help explain why he was continually able to avoid having his background and parole status discovered. In the time Gacy was married to his second wife, he would murder 3 men. The previously mentioned Timothy McCoy, 16 years old, a to this day unknown 14 to 18-year-old boy, and one of his employees, John Butkovich, 17. John had come to Gacy's home for a final paycheck, as he worked under Gacy's new company, PDM Contractors Incorporated. John would never be seen or heard from again. John's body would be the first to be uncovered the day Gacy was arrested. According to John's parents, they contacted police over 100 times, that's right, 100 times, and urged them to investigate Gacy further for the disappearance of their son. Their pleas fell on deaf ears, for as far as we know, Gacy was never even questioned at this time. During these murders, Gacy continued to disguise who he really was to the community. He was involved in local politics, organizing parties and community projects, and began to volunteer his time to local children's hospitals, all while dressing up as Pogo the Clown. In October of 1975, Gacy's wife filed for divorce after he admitted that he was attracted to young men. According to Hoff, the news did not come as a surprise, as months before Gacy told her that they would no longer be having sex together. Hoff was bothered by all the gay pornography lying around the house, and even was aware of teenage males coming in and out of the house. Here we have another failure, but this time it doesn't come at the hands of the justice system. Had Hoff reported Gacy having sex with underage males to his parole officer, or even just local authorities, there's a chance Gacy could have been violated and locked up. Sadly, this wasn't done, and Gacy was allowed to continue his ways. After the divorce, Gacy would ramp up the intensity and frequency of his killings. From 1976 to 1978, Gacy would manage to rape, torture, murder, and dispose of 29 boys and young men underneath his home's crawl space and driveway, with 4 more having been dumped in the nearby Des Moines River. Let's go through what we know during this 2-year period of bloodshed. Be aware, the following is a graphic description of Gacy's method of torture, rape, and murder. To understand just how many met their end at Gacy's hands, I'll show the pictures of all 33 victims here. Due to the number of victims, many of whom would remain unknown for years after their discovery, and Gacy's own refusal to cooperate with police, we do not know in what exact order the victims were killed. However, we do know Gacy's methodology, including how he would often talk his victims into restraining themselves. In Gacy's own words, he would bring back the victims to his home. Many knew of him or were won over by his charisma and charm, believing him to be a friend or a role model. Gacy would offer to show the boys a magic trick, and would handcuff himself behind his back. After they confirmed that he was really handcuffed, he would then open the cuffs and offer to show the boys how to do the trick. The victims would literally allow themselves to be handcuffed behind their back by Gacy. When asked how he did it, Gacy would smile, pull out a handcuff key from his pocket, and exclaim, "I just used the key." After this, Gacy would then tell his victims what he was going to do to them as a means of psychological torture. Gacy would then further subdue them with chloroform, whereafter he would rape them. Gacy describes one of his methods as garroting, where he would tie a rope or cord around their neck and use a stick to tighten it, sort of like a tourniquet. He would do this until they passed out, and then let off the pressure, causing them to regain consciousness after a short time. Gacy was truly cruel and sadistic to do this, enjoying every moment he was in control. It's hard to imagine what these victims, almost all young teenage boys, were going through during this. After some time, Gacy would eventually keep the garrote tight, ultimately killing them. Gacy would then proceed to bury them in the various crawl spaces of his home, using lime to assist in the decomposition process. There was only one victim who managed to escape from Gacy during this time. 16-year-old Tony Antonucci was offered a job by Gacy, which he took to save up for a car. One night, while Tony's family was out of town, Gacy unexpectedly stopped by. When Tony answered the door, Gacy told him he had been in the neighborhood and wanted to check in on him. Tony says that Gacy was joking with him and challenging him to a wrestling match, as Tony was a high school wrestler. Tony said that he was having fun and took it as a challenge, so they started wrestling. After a short time, Tony says Gacy placed a handcuff over one wrist, causing him to panic and start struggling to avoid his other hand being cuffed. A significantly bigger Gacy was eventually able to cuff the other hand. Unbeknownst to Gacy, Tony was able to free one hand painfully from the cuffs, and Tony says that he was able to take Gacy down by the legs and handcuff him. According to Tony, Gacy's face was in utter shock. Gacy allegedly said, "You know, you're the only one that not only got out of the handcuffs, you got them on me." According to Tony, Gacy was able to convince Tony it was all just a challenge he did with his friends and employees, and as such, he said he continued to work for him after that until shortly before Gacy's final arrest. The rest of Gacy's victims would not be so fortunate. In 1976, Gacy would go on to take the lives of 14 victims. In 1977, he would take 10 more lives. And finally, in 1978, he would be stopped after the destruction of 5 more young men and boys. That brings us to Gacy's greatest mistake, the murder of Robert Peast. On December 11, 1978, 15-year-old Robert Peast went missing after a shift at his pharmacy. According to his co-worker, a 17-year-old Kim Byers, Robert had gone outside to talk to Gacy, who was giving an estimate for a contract job at the pharmacy. Gacy had offered Robert a summer job working for him, paying him twice what the pharmacy job would pay him. This would be the last time anyone would see Robert alive again. Byers reported Robert's mother came looking for him, and Byers told her about the job offer Robert had received. When he didn't return, he was reported missing. This case was assigned to Detective Joseph Kozenczak. He would go on to determine Gacy had been the contractor at the pharmacy that day when he would check with the owner, who told him he had spoken with Gacy of PDM Contractors. Kozenczak would make contact with Gacy by phone, and Gacy would initially be reluctant to meet, making up excuses about a death in the family. However, Gacy did deny ever meeting Peast or talking to him. Kozenczak would be, as far as we know, the very first officer to actually do a background check on Gacy, and of course discovered his criminal record of sodomy. This discovery put Gacy at the top of his suspect list. Gacy would eventually come into the police station, he and his vehicle covered in mud. As Kozenczak was not there, Gacy would return the next day and speak with detectives. The first search warrant on Gacy's home would be served on December 14, 1978. During a search of the home, multiple items of note would be found. Firstly, a 1975 high school class ring with the initials JAS would be discovered, among numerous driver's licenses of teenage boys, handcuffs, books on homosexuality and pedophilia, clothing far too small for Gacy, as well as a pistol. The biggest piece of evidence found would be the least suspicious, at least initially. A receipt for photo development from the pharmacy where Peast worked was discovered. That alone was able to prove that Peast had at least been in Gacy's home. Also noted while investigators were inside was the smell of decomposition coming from the vents of the home. Due to the limitations of the search warrant, officers at this time were unable to damage the floor of the home and check what the smell was being caused by, but Gacy claimed it to be a sewage line. Detectives would come to realize that the class ring they found belonged to a missing teenager, John Allen Scheck. At this time, around-the-clock surveillance team was put on Gacy. From this point forward, Gacy would not make a single move without being watched. On December 14th, a day after the first search warrant, police were contacted by Michael Rossi, an employee and former roommate of Gacy's. Rossi wanted to inform officers that he believed that Gacy was behind the death of a former employee, Charles Hatula, who had been found drowned a year prior. Detectives also became aware that Gacy had a pending battery charge against him. The victim in this case claimed Gacy had lured him into his car, knocked him out with chloroform, repeatedly raped and beat him, and then dumped him in a park. The victim had burns to his face and chest and was covered in bruises. This case would be settled out of the courts for $3,000. December 18th. In a second statement to police, Michael Rossi informs them that he had been made to spread 10 bags of lime in the crawl space of his home, just last year. During the investigation, detectives were able to make contact with a former roommate of Gacy's, David Cram. Cram stated that he too had been made to spread lime in the crawl space of the home, and was also asked to dig several trenches, roughly the size of human graves. Detectives now had a mountain of evidence and began to apply for a more intensive second search warrant to include the crawl space. December 21st, 1978. At this point, the pressure of the investigation and constantly being followed began to get to Gacy. While being followed, Gacy drove to a nearby gas station and gave an attendant a bag of marijuana, telling him, "The end is coming for me. They're going to kill me." The attendant gave the weed over to the officers that were following Gacy. For the rest of that day, Gacy was seen driving to all manner of friends and family's homes, reportedly to say his goodbyes. Due to this behavior, detectives began to worry that Gacy was suicidal and as such made the decision to place him under arrest for the marijuana so they could hold him as a second search warrant had just been signed. Gacy's graveyard. As officers arrived at Gacy's home, they discovered that prior to being arrested, Gacy had turned off the pump in his crawl space, causing it to be filled with sewage. Perhaps this was an attempt to get rid of the evidence, or perhaps just to make detectives' jobs that much harder. In either case, it would not hide what was found beneath the Gacy residence. After draining the crawl space, crime scene technician Daniel Gentry began to dig and discovered the partial remains of a human arm, calling out to inform the detectives of the first of many grim discoveries. After years of horror, John Wayne Gacy has finally been stopped, but detectives had only scratched the surface of the death caused by Gacy. When he was informed that they had found the first body, he confessed and began to show detectives where most of the bodies were buried, and also stated that he had thrown 5 more in the Des Plaines River. With Detective Rafael Tovar and a team of 10 men working the scene, it would take over a month to recover 27 bodies buried under the floor of the home, and an additional 2 bodies under the garage and driveway. 4 out of 5 of the bodies Gacy told investigators about would be recovered from the river. All in all, the excavation process would take months, with investigators digging 8 feet deep in the crawl space and nearly having to demolish the home. Gacy would go on to be convicted of 33 counts of murder. Due to Illinois not having the death penalty during most of the murders, Gacy would be sentenced to 21 counts of life in prison and 12 counts of death, where he would ultimately be executed on May 10, 1994. While we know of 33 murders, Gacy's last words to detectives would be that he estimated he had killed 45. After Gacy's arrest, several others would come forward and claim to have been victimized by Gacy, including a 9-year-old boy who claimed he was raped at a department store. The true number of Gacy's victims remains unknown, but the police have not yet given up so many decades later. In November of 1998, a tip would come into police claiming that Gacy was seen one night burying something in his backyard. Equipment would be brought in to scan the yard, with no bodies having been recovered. In 2016, another effort was made to search the property lawn, citing an insufficient search had been done the first time. A search warrant was denied by the state attorney, and the property's current owners also declined another search. After the discovery of Gacy's victims, 8 remained unidentified. In 2011, with advances being made to DNA technology, and thanks to the efforts of police, 3 more victims would be identified. 45 years later, the Cook County Sheriff's Office still hasn't given up in identifying the remaining 5. They still have an entire section of their website dedicated to this. Some of the difficulties here are that even after the publication of Gacy's crimes, many of the victims had never been reported missing at all. If you've seen my video on Dahmer, you already know this is something that greatly hinders police investigations, and one of the many reasons killers tend to get away with their crimes for so long. I'll share the information from Cook County Sheriff's Office here. If you suspect a family member or friend may have been one of his victims, and they match the description given and went missing during this time in or near Chicago, there is a form to fill out, and if you're willing, you can submit a DNA sample to help in identification. Gacy would go on to be known as one of the most horrific serial killers in United States history. Unfortunately, as we covered, there were multiple instances where Gacy could have been caught or stopped early. Even more would come up after the investigation. An anonymous neighbor would come forward after the publication of Gacy's crimes and share a chilling story. She and her son would sometimes wake up late at night to the sounds of crying or screaming and yelling, but they say they could never pinpoint exactly which house it came from. It is unknown if this was ever reported to the police, but they claim it went on for years. In our series, we ask the question, how did they get away with it for so long? The answer is often complicated, with several reasons. The main takeaway here, despite instances of police incompetence and Gacy preying on many victims that were never reported missing, is that Gacy should not have been released at all. A parole board releasing a violent offender convicted of a heinous crime is something we've seen before and will continue to see. Further, we know that Gacy's subsequent crimes should have resulted in a violation of probation, thus putting him behind bars again. But sadly, we know what the actual outcome was. I hope you guys liked the video. I'll have more coming every week, so subscribe if you like the content. If you have any suggestions on topics you'd like to hear, put them in the comments. I have more videos that I'm already working on, so stay tuned and stay safe, guys.